Hi, I'm Dawn Marie Solis, and I'm with INIS 2022 Neurodiversity Conference, and I am here today with Caroline Mills and Kristy Coxon, and they are doing some amazing research work in the world of older autistic adults. They're going to be able to explain it way better than I can, and so we'll all learn together. But Kristy, can I ask you please to start us off and just give us an idea of who you are, and then how you and Caroline came to be working and what it is you're working on, and then we'll turn to Caroline and you can say your bit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. We're very passionate, Caroline and I, about the area of research. So it's a pleasure for us to be able to talk to you about it this evening for us. So Caroline and I are occupational therapists, and we've both had extensive clinical and research careers. But Caroline's worked in the area of working with autistic children and a lot of research as well as clinical experience in that area. And I've spent a lot of clinical time and research working with older people. And what we found is we had a crossover, a connection between working in terms of participation and helping people participate both in everyday occupations as well as community and community activities. And what we were looking at was this major gap in the research about older autistic people. So Caroline and I came together and used her experience in looking and investigating and working with people with autism, and my experience working with older people. And we started a journey of research looking at aging well for an autistic older adult. We started off by having a look at the literature to see what was available, and we noticed that there's a huge gap in what is actually currently known about older autistic people. And we can talk a little bit more about what we've found to date. But you know, what even does aging well mean for an older autistic person? Has anybody asked them? What occupations do older autistic people want or engage in? And this also led us to further questions such as, are health professionals ready to assist and help people engage in meaningful activities in later life?
That's so interesting. I'm having a million thoughts, but Caroline, I'm going to let you talk first before I dive into all of the thoughts.
Okay, yeah, great. No, thanks so much for having us. I'm Caroline Mills. I've been an occupational therapist for nearly 20 years now, and most of that time has been spent supporting children with disabilities and their families, in particular autistic children, and their families in a school setting. So not so much in the aged care setting, but a lot of work with autistic children. My PhD research was also with autistic children. And when I came into the university and we started to think about what happens to autistic children when they become autistic adults, and we know that we spend most of our life as adults, and what happens to them when they age into older adulthood. And this came out of a conversation that I had with a longtime colleague of mine who happens to have worked with children and with older people. And this colleague, I said, hey, you work in aged care now. Do you get any autistic people in your aged care? And this therapist said to me, I don't know. They grow out of it, don't they? And I thought, well, no, they don't. and where are they? And there may be just a lost generation. And what I thought is that there is just this beautiful wealth of experience that we see in occupational therapists and other similar professionals supporting older adults. There's this wealth of knowledge. And then there's a wealth of knowledge of occupational therapists and similar professionals who support children with disabilities, in particular autistic children. But we're in silos, and never the twain shall meet. And so if we're going to do a good job, we need to come together, and we need to look at what even what are the things that we know from the wealth of literature written about how to support autistic children, to what extent does that apply to supporting participation in older adulthood for autistic people? What things about autism remain? What are the good things we know about autism support that still apply in older adulthood? And I don't think we really know too many of the answers to those questions yet. So that's why we've embarked on this program of research.
I find what you're doing so exciting, and I want to come play with you all. Being 53 years old, I'm sort of on the cusp of what you're researching, and I came to understand my neurodivergent identity at the age of 50. So I haven't lived in my truth for very long. And so I really relate, Caroline, to what you just said, don't they age out of it or whatever. I think a lot of people, if they didn't get identified as children, don't get identified as adults. And so there isn't this sort of long-term ability to see lots of us, in part because even to get noticed as a child, you tend to need to have an accompanying disability. There needs to be something that to the outside world significantly impacts your life in a disabling kind of way. And so somebody like me who was able to mask well, who was highly verbal, appeared to be social, and got good grades, nobody's paying attention. And I wasn't telling anybody my levels of depression, the things that were hard for me, the places where I was just totally baffled by that world out there, right? So if people are like me, I think they're getting all the way through till their final days and nobody's noticing. Everybody else is in a different kind of care, right? They have a significant disability, that there are people involved in their lives. And so, Kristy and Caroline, I'm really interested in so much. I have to settle I refer to my ADHD as thought monkeys. They're all very happy and noisy right now. So I'm going to try to pick one and let it speak. I think the idea of elder participation is something that is undervalued in general, at least here in the United States. I don't believe here in the United States we're thinking about that as well as we could. And that's me being very polite. And so from what you're saying, my guess is maybe it's the same in Australia. And so I can see how your work on behalf of the autistic aging population would have benefits for all. I don't, and I could be totally ignorant and mistaken, but I don't see your work as something that would only benefit the autistic aging population. Can either or both of you speak about that a little bit, please?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think what we sometimes see with what I've seen in the provision of supports is that sometimes they're targeted and they're autism specific. And I myself worked for a long time for an autism specific organization. But I think if we can identify some of these supports that do support autistic people, they're also going to support other people. And some of these are like basic kind of environmental type supports. I suppose we're talking about, I'm in talks on another conference presentation for the Australian National Conference, which is about neurodiversity affirming practice and what that looks like in adulthood, in older adulthood, but also in younger adulthood, and across the sort of lifespan. And it's, so I guess we're not, I suppose the focus of our particular research is that we've looked for autism, but I think it's certainly more broad in terms of how some of those good supports apply. Definitely.
Absolutely. And I can talk about it a little bit from the older person perspective, that there are so many differences in terms of what happens to your roles and your occupations as you age. So there's a significant change, and nobody likes to talk about it too much, but, you know, people, they lose roles, they change roles. And, you know, some people are more successful than others in you know, swapping out the big work role when a person retires for other leisure activities or other meaningful volunteering roles or other activities that help them feel part and connected to the community. And certainly in the research, we know that being able to engage in meaningful occupation leads to health and well-being benefits. And that's no different for an older person with a disability or a person who's aging or a younger person. That's very clear. So I think you're absolutely right that with older people, we start to have a deficit model. We think about what people can't do and then when we start to look at the deficits, we think about, well, how's a person going to care for themselves? So we're talking about the really basic everyday occupations to get back into. We're not thinking about how are they going to feel connected? How are they going to, you know, really engage in an occupation that brings meaning to their life? And yes, it might be important for the person to be able to care for themselves, but what really brings that meaning and that well-being and those health values? And I think that's really a tricky question, you know, as for us as occupational therapists. It also comes back down to, yes, we have terrific models of practice and we want to look at these vast areas of different occupations to help people engage. But then there's the you know, well, who's going to provide that service? How is it going to be funded? So there are a lot of complexities in the area of older people, and this research could benefit, you know, a whole wide array of people.
I appreciated what you said about the difference between a deficit model.
Mm.
And I don't have your exact words, so I don't want to misquote you, but, you know, a big part of my advocacy is to acknowledge where things are hard, but
Yes.
start where things are able.
Yes.
And, you know, if I'm struggling to ride a bicycle, I don't throw the bicycle away, right? I figure out what are my abilities, and I put those abilities to work. Because if somebody just tells me, well, you can't, then okay. Right? So if I'm trying to ride the bicycle and I'm struggling, somebody needs to see both aspects of me. What am I doing well?
Yes.
So they can tell me, keep doing that. And what needs tweaking so that I can be more successful at riding the bicycle. So for me in my advocacy work and the structure of this conference, it is very much focused on, without being ableist, right? Focusing on everybody has aspects of themselves that feel unburdened or less burdened, and aspects that feel somewhat burdened to more burdened. And if we start with what's feeling good, what are you loving about yourself? What do you feel like really focused on? What do you feel really able to do? I think we have a path that allows us to understand how to help those things that don't feel quite so naturally able or that feel disabled in some way. Are you seeing sort of the same thing? Does that resonate with the work you're trying to do?
Oh, absolutely. How can we use a person's strengths to overcome some of their challenges? And I think, you know, there are some areas of practice that do that better than others. But certainly if we take a strength-based approach into the way that we help people, then I think it's very motivating for the person, and you can start to get that reward and benefit Because if a person, you know, starts to achieve and uses strengths and then sees that, you know, things are improving or they're able to do something, then it also gives them strength to tackle some of the not so easy things that are a little bit more difficult in the person's life. So yeah, that's a really important consideration, and that resonates with what we're doing in our work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something, taking what we call a strengths and interests focus is something that we would try to do a lot. Even when I worked with young people, some of whom had quite severe disabilities or had quite high support needs, sometimes you get in there and all of the talk is about this deficit focus, what this child can't do, what this young person can't do. And it's about circling back around to stop. Who is this person? What are their occupations? What are their strengths? What are their interests? What are they good at? Tell me that. Let's start from there. And some people we went in to see said, wow, nobody's ever asked me that about my child before, which is kind of alarming. And so I think we need to bring the same approach into adulthood in terms of the kinds of supports we're providing for people and the kind of focus we take.
And I think we've got an opportunity to change the narrative around focused interests. And that particularly in later life, focused interests might be a real benefit to an autistic person. You know, they might have something that they really engage and it's very, very meaningful to them, you know, in that period of time of life, whereas other people, you know, are looking at new occupations or finding occupations that replace other occupations to gain the same level of meaning. So, you know, in childhood, Caroline would talk, you know, in our conversations and say that, you know, focused interests were seen as very negative, or taking, you know, the child away from the other things that they should be learning or doing or expected to do or behave. Whereas we might have the opportunity in later life to change that narrative around focused interests.
Yeah, and the recognition that if you spend a long time doing something, you get really good at it and you might get a lot of meaning and fulfillment out of it. And what we have even in the diagnostic criteria for autism is a criteria around repetitive and restricted interests. And we see that these things are pathologized and seen as a problem. And it's interesting when you put a person with a disability in the context of having a focused interest or a passion about something, and it's seen as a problem. But if you take a person without a disability and you give them a focused interest, then they end up making a career out of it, and then people pay them a lot of money and
they're an expert.
And isn't that amazing? And so why do we take one group of people and pathologize focused interest when anybody with a PhD basically has perseverated on something for 4 years or 6 years and they've earned themselves a degree? So why do we not see that or recognize that having a focused interest can be quite a positive thing for a person?
Yeah, I've muddled over the idea. I wonder how many PhD holders are autistic because of the level of the amount of time you have to spend, how detailed you have to make.
Yeah.
Maybe PhD people just are special interested people that had money to spend on education.
Yeah.
But, in terms of the research that you're now doing, so I think I understand sort of the overall focus, but do you have like a stated theory or something that you've begun your research with and you're comparing your results to your theory model?
The model with our scoping review, yeah, we were very much starting with scoping, which is a very kind of open methodology to start with. And we were pulling peer-reviewed literature, but also things like guidelines and grey literature. And one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was people over the age of 50, but also we wanted to focus on participation. And the things that we included had to connect to participation. And so a lot of things were excluded because a lot of things are about people under the age of 50, or they are not focused on participation. So there's lots of papers that are about medication. There's lots of papers that are about cognition and memory. and diagnosis and some of these kinds of things that weren't in our area of interest. So we started really from that lens of participation, with the view to, and we've used one of the occupational therapy theoretical models, which is the person environment occupational performance model, which is how we're going to sort of organize our findings of our scoping review.
So for folks that aren't as familiar with the terminology of your work, because the conference is really trying to invite anyone who wants to dip their toe in this water, where many of us are not going to have any idea what you just said. So can you give us, I think there were 3 definitions I pinpointed. First was scoping. I think I understand, but I think a mini definition of what that is would be good. And then what you mean by participation, because I think even culturally we may, people might have different ideas of what that means. And then, well, let's just start with those 2. Let's start with those 2. I think that's good.
Do you want to tell us about scoping, Kristy?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Caroline and I started with was a scoping review, and that's a specific methodology that helps guide us in the process of systematically reviewing all the literature that has been written about a particular topic. And our topic was aging well in participation for older autistic people. So we spent a long time coming up with a search strategy where we could look at all the databases and we could look at the grey literature as well as the peer-reviewed literature, so that we were able to capture anything and everything that we could find written about older autistic people participating in everyday life. So that's the methodology that we used in terms of the research and how we've begun this journey. And in terms of participation, so we're from Australia, so we've been talking about participation as what a person chooses to do in everyday life. So we take a very traditional view of the word occupation, and we view it as anything that a person does that occupies their everyday life. So a person should have choice in regards to what they participate in. Some things we do, we need to do, or we're expected to do in life, and they're all included in a person's participation. And from our clinical and professional backgrounds, we believe that there are several areas that people can participate in. And so whether that be things that people do for leisure and fun, whether it's things that they do for productivity, such as work or schooling, and things that people do to care for themselves or maintain themselves.
Okay, thank you. And I remembered the third one. It's gray literature, and I know the difference between peer-reviewed and gray, but I'm guessing there's going to be 1 or 2 folks that's a new term for them. Can you tell us the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So peer-reviewed literature is what we see in academic writing, and most of the peer-reviewed literature you'll see in academic journals. And they're very easy for us to search because they're already set up in huge databases that we can go and we can systematically use a search strategy and find and extract that literature. Grey literature is a little bit trickier to find, and it might not have been peer reviewed, but it might be a personal account from an autistic older person about their ability to go down to the shops and have a coffee at their cafe. Or it might include clinical, some sort of guidelines that have been written by a professional organisation. Or it could include, some sort of conceptual article that someone has written about ideas that they have that might influence a person with autism in later life. And there are particular ways that we search to make sure that we've been able to cast a net wide enough to collect that grey literature.
That sounds like an impressive task. Just thinking about needing to find all of those sources. And so I feel very encouraged that you were both willing to put in that effort, because, definitely the literature that comes out of academia, that is peer reviewed, that, has some legitimate, we did a thing, we did it this way, you can see the methodology, you can see the source work, and somebody else looked at it and said, yes, I like this part, no, I don't like this part, right? That's incredibly valuable. But I think one of the things that the neurodivergent community says all the time is, y'all do that in your buildings with the doors closed, and you don't ask us about it. And so the fact that you are including first person accounts and organizational knowledge and things like that, to me, that's very important, because the people are living this life.
Yeah, absolutely. And
go ahead.
And one of the things that we also include in not only this project but other projects is what we call a participatory research approach, which means that we include neurodiverse people into research teams, into advisory committees, to make sure that we don't do, as you just said, that we don't go into a nice little ivory tower university and close the door and write about people without them. So we have lots of different ways. So in this particular project, we have lucky enough to have Dr. Bill Wong, who is an autistic occupational therapist, who is also on that project with us, to he's an aged care clinician, but also a person with lived experience of autism. So he's got a kind of a dual expertise in that way. So we see there's this great wisdom, I suppose, in that lived experience, and we do need to incorporate that. And what increasingly we're seeing some of the journals doing, some of the autism journals are doing, is that they're saying, when you write an article, you need to make a statement about how you involved community stakeholders in your research, in your project. So you need to be, they're saying, we don't want to publish your stuff unless you've really spoken to the people who have a lived experience of this, you've considered their perspective, whether they're co-researchers, an advisory committee, some way for you to really make sure you've captured that all-important lived experience perspective so that your research can be relevant for practice.
And thank you also for acknowledging what a big task it was. I could tell you that Caroline and I have been title and abstract screening for over 700 individual hits of evidence. So it was a mammoth task, but you'd be surprised actually at how few we're going to call them records of evidence, because they're not all research articles, because we've got an array of different grey literature as well. It's a little bit scary, really, the amount of research that was actually, or records that were actually included. It was less than 20.
Wow.
From thousands.
Over 7,000.
Mm.
Wow. Yeah. Because of this conference, I've had the privilege of meeting individuals like you and Bill Wong, who told me about the work that you're doing. Autistic Doctors International and other groups and individuals that are finally starting to take the perspective that the community needs to be involved if you're going to be researching them. It's one thing if you're researching the ancient Aztecs, there's nobody around to talk to, and so you're really aware that everything you're doing is highly part theory, highly you definitely have the pottery and the things from the time, but you don't have the people. And so that it's 2022 and we're just finally starting to talk to the people. But for me, it's a little bit more than that. In the United States, and we'll just take the medical community, the education is lacking about neurodivergence. Most medical students, whether they be nurses or doctors or physical therapists, most are not getting good information about neurodivergence, if any at all. You can go all the way through all of your years of education and become a doctor or a nurse and receive no information about neurodivergence. And so, at least here in the United States, feels like a community that has been very neglected. Even though there is focus on children, even the children are not well thought about, expansively thought about, strengths thought about. The thinking going around folks is a little bit management, if that makes sense. How do we manage these folks, and how do we squeeze them into a space that doesn't fit them? That's, that's a big statement, and I don't mean to ignore people who are trying very hard to do differently, but the vast majority still seems to be a little mired in that thinking that the whole job is to figure out how to take these uncomfortably different people and stick them into a space that doesn't fit for them, instead of how do we expand our world to not only include but enjoy the benefits of these individuals. And so some of what I'm hearing both of you say, Kristy and Caroline, is that your research is looking at not only what an aging autistic population may be able to do, but how that might be personally and societally beneficial. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps with the model that Caroline spoke about that we're using, because we're able to think about personal narratives, so the story of the person who is the older autistic person, and then we can think about the community narrative, and then we can even think even a little bit broader and beyond, just the community, and go, further into society. So we're able, and we certainly will be looking at the literature to see how can we help tell that story, and use that information to to help, first of all, have a greater understanding of what living well in later life looks like for an autistic older person.
How long have you been doing this branch of research?
It's been a few years now. There was some setbacks because of COVID, we'd have to say, where we paused. We had some maternity leave in there where things were paused. And as you probably know, things got a bit crazy during COVID. So it's been a few years. It's probably been 2 or 3 years, and we're moving forward with a number of smaller projects and moving them all towards. Some of the projects are student projects. Some of them are projects just with academics. All of the projects are involving this kind of co-creation, participatory research, and making sure that we capture that autistic perspective, the neurodiverse perspective. And one of the things also in that model we've chosen is that it doesn't just look at the person's own things. Like sometimes when I would work with children and we look at some of these kinds of characteristics, and we can talk about a person's cognition, or we can talk about their motor skills, or we can talk about their social skills. But what we need to look at is also the environment, and accept that sometimes the environment is set up in such a way that it just doesn't support the person well. And what I would often see is environments that were set up very poorly, and then they put the young person in this environment and they fail in this environment because the environment's set up very poorly. And then it's because you have this label. That's why you failed in this environment. And it's like, no, have a look at some of the features of this environment in terms of how it was set up to support this person. How did you support social and communication skills in the environment? How did you consider the sensory aspects of the environment in terms of whether it was too bright or too loud? How were the expectations communicated in the environment? Were they really clearly laid out to the person? We're, eliminating as many of the ambiguities as possible. Did the person have a clear opportunity to ask for help if they needed it, or to explain their own situation in terms of how well they were coping? All of these things that can be built into an environment. And I think we need to do a better job with that. And what we've learned from supporting the environments of so younger people in, say, preschool or school, we need to bring that into, say, what does that look like in terms of supporting a person in a workplace? And what does that look like in terms of supporting a person if they have to go to a clinic or a hospital? And what does that look like if you have to support a person in terms of receiving aged care services in their home or in a residential facility? So that's the kind of thing we're also looking at.
And we're bringing the next generation of occupational therapists, because Caroline and I have teaching roles as well. So we are bringing the next generation of health professionals in our area of Western Sydney along in the journey. So making sure that what we learn through our research gets taught straight back into our classes.
That's fantastic. So if you've been doing this for about 3 years, I'm going to guess you don't yet have results that you would like to state out there in the world. But is there anything that you feel like you're seeing that maybe was different from your expectation?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of our preliminary findings, one of the things is something we touched on earlier about how these focused interests or special interests or things that might be pathologized in childhood are actually a strength and are protective for older adults. So you might have a better quality of life if you get up in the morning and you engage in an activity or in an occupation that you really enjoy. And that might be something that's called perseverating when we talk about children in schools, but actually that's something that's quite positive. And so that was a really kind of positive, surprising finding, and it's about communicating that back to people who do work with younger people in terms of reconceptualizing what that means. The other finding that we came out with was that social supports facilitate participation in older adult life. There's some assumptions around autism and socializing, and I think there's a fairly damaging assumption that autistic people or neurodivergent people don't want to socialize, they'd rather be alone, and we're finding that's quite false with what autistic adults are telling us. And what we're finding is that if you have a good amount of social support and the right kind of social support, that's something that facilitates your participation in older adulthood. So we certainly would want to push that idea forward, to think differently about what do social supports look like. And maybe if you're supporting an older person, that part of the work you do with them is to facilitate those social supports and social networks and work around those, because they are a protective thing we're finding.
That's fantastic. I can see your research having backwards impact. So you're focusing on the aging community, but just with the example you gave, if high interest in something or a high focus in something is beneficial for an older person, then it would make sense to back up with that and see how we can nurture that throughout a person's development. Because with a pathologizing of special interests, with a societal negative perspective on that, we infuse shame and sometimes trauma into those experiences, and then a person grows up without some of the more stabilizing benefits of how they're naturally wired. So I can see, just from that one example, but I'm sure there will be more where we can take what you find in your research and back it up to mean quality of life fully, not just in the older years. Kristy, I think you're both shaking your head yes, but do you have thoughts along those lines?
That would be an ultimate dream, I think, of Caroline and I, in terms of our research, to be able to just change this narrative, and not just in later life, but throughout life, so that some of those benefits of being, I don't want to use the word allowed, but I can't think of another one, but to be allowed to be celebrated in engaging in occupations that are meaningful. So if that is a focused interest, how can we, nurture, develop, and celebrate that along a person's life journey? Because, as occupational therapists, we strongly believe in the benefits, the health benefits of occupation. And we talk so much, we talk the talk about how they need to be meaningful. So to have a benefit, these activities that we do in everyday life have to have a meaning to us. And so if we can change that narrative and embed that throughout the life cycle, then I think we have, a lot of opportunity to make positive change. And also think about things in a strength-based approach as well.
Caroline, did you have thoughts you wanted to share on that?
Yeah, one of the other findings that came up, I'm just looking, I've got some notes on some of our preliminary findings, is that quality of life in older adulthood is facilitated, and for health professionals is facilitated by a mixture of supporting a person with what we call person factors. So these are the things that are internal to the person. So supporting their cognitive skills, supporting their social skills or whatever it is, but also supporting the environment. So if you put those two things together, that's what facilitated good quality of life.
I'm thinking, at least in terms of the United States, we have a cultural perspective that solitary, independent adult being is optimal. And so as you were saying, supporting, right? The different places you're supporting, I can hear the United States perspective be, oh, well, yes, of course, we have to take care of people who can't. And in my work, one of the things I'm trying to do is help people recognize that being able to do for yourself is only part of what makes a life good. It's being able to be in supportive community that makes life good, and that's for everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Kristy.
That's how many people in society today are truly 100% independent? We all work in codependence with each other. If a person is married or has a partner, there are certain strengths and ways that relationship about what activities and what people gravitate towards in terms of their contribution is always going to be of a co-relationship of existence, where one person is going to help the other. And I'm very blessed that I do not need to know how to do to balance our budget, because my husband's an accountant and he can do that, and I have no desire to learn, or to need that. But I don't need that, because I can exist very well in my codependence, in this relationship. I mean, if I needed to learn, I could learn. But this idea that people can, work in the world independently, in isolation, and must be able to do everything on their own, I think is a real myth.
I mean, the term I heard was interdependence. And I was at a conference in Singapore, the Asia Pacific Autism Conference, a couple of years ago in Singapore, and it came up as there's different kind of even different conceptualizations across cultures about how much it's acceptable for people to rely on each other. We see that in say, Asian cultures versus Australia or the United States. But when the CEO stood up, she said, you know, we need to get away from this idea of dependence, but we also need to get away from the idea of independence. What we're really working towards as a society is interdependence, because we need each other. And she was saying, she's like, even us who are professionals, she's like, we support people, but we don't have a purpose. We don't have a role without the people we support. We need them and they need us and we need each other. And so when you're in a community, people rely on you and you rely on people. So that's really what we're looking at, is interdependence. And that kind of blew my mind, coming from a place like Australia, where we talk especially in occupational therapy, and you go to a hospital and there's lots of talk about independence and being independent. And when you work in other countries, I've done some work in India and China, the concept of what independence means is completely different across different cultures in terms of how much you're supposed to do by yourself, how much you might rely on your family or your community to do things together. And that kind of blew my mind. And now I really challenge my university students. Yes, they go to units where they learn what independence means in terms of supporting a person, but I really challenge them to think about this concept of interdependence and how much they need. They need people around them and people need them. We find that we often say, well, children might be dependent on their parents, but children need their parents, but also parents need their children too. And so we sort of need each other. And I think it's good to reflect on that.
I love that. We just have a few minutes left. Is there anything, each of you independently, that you would really like to make sure this audience hears from you, in terms of your research or in terms of your perspective on the neurodivergent community itself? Really, in any way, is there something specific you'd really like this audience to hear from you?
I think we've had a really good conversation, and I think we've been able to say lots of things, and that there's a lot of opportunities in this space, and we'd love the opportunity to, at some stage in the future, be able to partner with, say, aged care service providers or aged care organizations to bring it to kind of work together to go, okay, how do we really implement some of this stuff so that it can live in the real world in the context of supporting participation in older adulthood? And what does that look like? So it's a bit watch this space. But yeah, that's about all I have to say.
And along those lines, I was going to say, Caroline and I are just getting started. So that there's a lot of research that needs to be done in this area. And, the idea that out of 7,000 records that we have sought through, to have 20 records that actually look at older autistic people and the way they participate in later life, there's a real gap. And we don't want to be saying to our, next generation of health professionals or autistic people or their support networks, mind the gap. We want to be able to give more information, more guidance. We want to be able to celebrate the strengths, and we want to be able to have, a community where everyone can participate and do the things that they need and want to do in everyday life.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for talking with me. I hope I can circle back after September 24th when this goes live. The continuing work of INIS will be smaller, more focused, online only events in between the annuals. And so, let me know who you want to talk to. I'll run out in the world and see if I can find them.
Thank you.
That'd be great.
It's one of my superpowers. I find people and I put them together. But I think that another more focused event where the work you're doing could be included with, folks who are doing similar work. A big part of my desire is to find ways to be more sharing information, that we break down the silos. That's why, you know, you're participating in a conference that's also hearing from firsthand experience people, and from an organization called Music for Autism. And so that, you know, this conference really is about breaking down those silos and sharing information across the way, because we never know what we will learn from each other and what we will find from each other. And I think I just so hope lots and lots of people listen to this conversation, because what you two are doing, in my view, I mean, even selfishly, like, please hurry up, do your research, right? Like, I'm an autistic adult over 50. Selfishly, I am thrilled about what you're doing, but I also see so much potential positive impact for the work you're doing. And I hope people join you, and that we find ways of doing so much more. So thank you each. I really appreciate your time and your efforts and the work that you're doing.
And thank you so much for having us. And if anyone would like to reach out, please send us an email. The time difference between Australia and the US is a little bit tenuous. However,
we can make it work.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both, and we will talk again.
Thank you.
All right. All the best for the conference.